Hey, welcome to Farm Journal Live. I'm editor Clinton Griffiths coming to you from our newsroom here in northern Indiana as we kind of get started on another big week for agriculture, including a couple of big reports due out later this week. Corn and wheat prices on the rise today in early trade. Soybeans also higher here at midday. We'll be getting a couple of those big reports, official acreage number and the grain stock reports. Those come out tomorrow at midday. We'll also be getting another crop progress report from USDA at 4 Eastern today. That should give us an update on crop conditions. Now, last week we saw a reduction in condition ratings for the soybean crop. Corn conditions were just about a point better. Why don't we go ahead and bring in Chip Nellinger. He's with Reef Agrimarketing to join us. And Chip, as we look at these reports, what is your take? What are you expecting this week from USDA?
Yeah, I think myself, as well as most of the rest of the industry, expecting a shift lower in corn acreage, maybe upwards of 1.5 million acres, maybe a touch higher on bean acreage, to the tune of about 500,000 acres or so, maybe a touch more. I think that's pretty well expected. The real wild card is always the stocks reports, and they're so hard to peg that it makes, these quarterly reports are very, very volatile. So I think going into the report, the general consensus is lower corn acres, higher bean acres. The real wild card is the stocks number. You throw all that in the mix. We've got a short week because there's no markets Friday, an early close Thursday because of the holiday coming up. You've got the end of the month and end of the quarter in there, and so you have the makings add some potential weather volatility in there, and we could have a real interesting choppy week this week.
It could be an interesting choppy week. Talk about what factors you'll be looking at as far as on that, what's going to make up that grain stocks report. What things could we be seeing adjustments to?
Yeah, I think this is going to be, as I mentioned, the real wild card. It's hard to peg these quarterly stocks numbers. Remember, it's different than the ending stocks. It's what's on hand as of the 1st of June in storage, both on farm and at commercial storage, as well as transport, be that in barges and rail cars. So it's a little bit of a wild card. It gives us a glimpse into probably the most important thing is you can start backing into what the feed usage number is. We know, on a weekly basis what the ethanol grind is. We know what we're selling as far as exports, and the real unknown is the feed side of the equation. So that's going to give us a little better snapshot. A lot of animals on feed, we got to remember that, and there's a lot of arguments that this corn feed usage number has been historically for the last couple of years understated. So that could be the shock, if there is one, is that the corn stocks end up being lower than expected because the feed usage has been higher, and that's really what could throw a monkey wrench in the Bears' plans right now. So that could be, if any, the real wild card that we're looking at here.
Chip, as we go through the rest of July, obviously you mentioned weather as something to be watching this week, but through the rest of this month, that seems like something we'll be keying in on.
Absolutely. The weather is going to be key. There's a lot of heat building. Here in Illinois, we only had, I believe, 2 90-degree days at all last summer. We've had that by now, and really the local forecast here for about the next 14 days, it basically doesn't get under 90 and for a high. And so on top of that, some areas didn't receive the rainfall that was needed. So we've got some rougher looking crops in areas here. Weather is definitely going to be a key, especially if that heat stays up. We're going to need more rain, and we're going to need to get through grain fill here in late July and the first half of August without, a lot of heat. So it still very much matters. There were some beneficial rains around over the weekend, like starting last Friday and over the weekend, more in the forecast, but certainly not every location is getting it, and that's going to be closely watched going forward the next few weeks.
Chip, I've been asking all of our guests this question since this whole coronavirus thing started. What's one thing you're optimistic about in 2020?
Oh, the one thing I'm optimistic about, and that's a tough question, Clinton.
It is, especially this year.
Yeah, I think the fact that even though it's been a challenge, it's nothing like the challenge that farmers saw last year as far as trying to get the crop in. It looks in most areas like we've got better opportunities for a good crop and good yields this year. So I'm optimistic that we're going to have good yields, and that's coming. And agriculture always finds a way to get through the rough patches, and I think we're at least on the other side of getting to some better times out there.
All right, Chip Nellinger, thanks so much. Reef Agrimarketing, appreciate your time today on Farm Journal Live. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks so much. What will the impacts of the coronavirus be on food and agricultural markets long term? That question is one that economists are going to be trying to answer for years to come. The Council for Agricultural Science and Technology and the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association just releasing a new, we're going to call it a white paper. You could call it a report. The paper's authors looked at everything from trade to supply chain disruptions, even changes in consumer behavior. Purdue University's Jason Lusk, one of the authors of that. And Mr. Lusk, thank you so much for joining us here on Farm Journal Live. Give us just a quick, what were your takeaways from this paper that just came out?
Well, it's been a roller coaster ride, no doubt about it. And I think some of the takeaways are going to be focused on resiliency. What things can we look forward to in the future to make sure that should something like this happen again, we're better prepared for it. I think we already heard Chip talk a little bit about the current agricultural markets. It's certainly been a big hit to the agricultural sector, but they're not alone. If you're an owner of a restaurant or other parts of the food sector have experienced some real significant challenges here. So a big part of the report is trying to quantify some of those magnitudes of losses. One of the papers, in fact, talked about the challenges faced by rural hospitals, which is something often we don't think about. So it's a pretty comprehensive report as far as that goes, and just trying to get a handle on what were the challenges, what were the impacts to farmers, and what can we do to think about making sure we're better prepared next time.
Is there anything that you've seen since this all started back in late February, early March, that you, from an agricultural perspective, you think we'll do differently going forward?
Boy, I hope so. In some ways, I think what the pandemic revealed is how much we take for granted in our food system. And yes, there were a lot of challenges, a lot of disruptions. At the same time, I think we should be proud to have a food system, an agricultural supply chain that was as resilient as it was, even though we certainly had some challenges in some parts of that. But I think there'll be some discussions around things like more automation perhaps in some of our processing sector. What can we do to make sure there aren't regulations that keep food from flowing from food away from home to the food at home sector? Those are the kinds of conversations and things I think that we'll have going forward.
Do you think this changes any of the kind of the consumer facing supply chain? I mean, obviously restaurants hit hard. We heard about restaurants that were selling their own groceries to people out in the community, just trying to make ends meet. Do you think there's long-term structural changes on that end of things?
I think it's very likely. Big increase in online food purchases. That was already a positive trend, but a really big spike up in terms of numbers of people buying food online for either at-home delivery or pickup in the store. So once people have gotten accustomed to that, that may cause some big structural change in the future. For example, and this is speculation, but we may have retail grocery stores that are much smaller because we're buying all of our prepackaged goods online, and we go to the physical store for maybe fruits and vegetables, meat that we want to pick out in person. That's a kind of structural change that you might see coming out of this. I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but you could see long-term. On the consumer attitude side, I think a lot of interest in direct-to-consumer sales and delivery, particularly on the meat side of things. It's still a very, very small share of the overall market, but I think we've certainly seen rising interest in some of those kinds of forms of agriculture.
What do you think the ag industry, and I'm going to ask this question because I really feel like we did see a spike in people's interest in food, how food's produced, like, folks having to focus on it more, maybe caring more about, how they're getting that, what the processes are. What can agriculture do to continue that conversation from here on out?
I think it's a great point, and it's a real opportunity to have some discussions. And just speaking for me personally, anecdotally, I've done a lot of interviews and media over the years, but I probably did more in the last 3 months than I did in the last 30 years. And I just think that speaks to the interest that consumers have in trying to understand what's happening, and it also speaks to how little people actually know about where their food's coming from. And I think that's an opportunity and a challenge sometimes to talk to people, about things like possibility of, euthanizing hogs. That's not a very pleasant conversation one has to have, but it's the kind of conversations that you have to bring up and be able to talk about if you want people to try to understand what's happening. I'll put in a little bit of a plug for a publication we put out at Purdue, that's tried to put some illustrations and a few Q&As, because we were getting inundated with questions about why is it farmers are plowing under some fields of fruit and vegetables
Right.
at the same time that they can't get them in the grocery store. Just try to answer some of those questions. I think again, it's an opportunity, but a challenge.
Yeah, I personally answered and fielded a lot of those questions with my own family and friends, and it is interesting how all of a sudden the interest in the supply chain and how this works, and well, why not this and why that? It's been kind of fascinating to watch, not pleasant, but fascinating. As you look into 2020, I want you to give me something that you're optimistic about in the year ahead.
I'm glad I had a little bit of time to think about that.
Yeah. That's right. Sorry, Chip.
I heard your question earlier. Yeah. Like I said, I think I'm proud of the way the food system and our agricultural system responded to this, challenge, these really unexpected shocks. At the same time, I think it's good to sometimes have an opportunity to sit back and reflect and ask, what can we do better, and ask questions about, are there laws and regulations that are preventing our food system from operating as effectively as it can? Are there ways we could structure these systems to be better? I think it's, there's some opportunities that come out of these challenges, and hopefully it will open the door to some conversations that we wouldn't have had before.
All right. Jason Luss, thank you so much with Purdue University. Really appreciate you joining us here on Farm Journal Live. I know you're a busy guy right now. Thanks for being here today. And thank all of you for joining us today on our broadcast for Farm Journal Live. Of course, if you'd like to keep up with the very latest in the agricultural industry, you can do that by going to agweb.com or find us on a host of other sites, social media and otherwise. We really appreciate your time. Again, everybody have a great week. We'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks for... It started as social distancing, self-isolation, and caring for loved ones. A time for agriculture to be proud, to be essential. Now, it's changing. While states start to reopen and jobs resume, out here, the clouds are building. The path is uncertain. It's not the first time, it won't be the last. But we'll farm on. This soil is soaked in generations of sweat, of reinvention, of grit. Farm on is a calling. It's a mantra, a mindset. When the horizon dims and things turn dark, we'll find the light. We may be doing this for you, but we're also doing it for them. 2020, now's the time to farm on.